Welcome viewers, welcome you to MOOC's online course on Introduction to Modern Western Art. Today is the fourth module of the first week. This module and the forthcoming module, that is the last module of this week, fifth module. In both these modules, we will be looking at the beginnings of modern art. Hence, this module is titled as Beginnings of Modern Art 1, followed by the fifth module will be titled as Beginnings of Modern Art 2. And we have already discussed that why we call or we use the phrase beginnings of modern art, not beginning, as there are several beginnings of modern art, not one. So one of those beginnings have been identified in mid-19th century around two very significant art movements called Romanticism and Realism. Now, before we discuss the characteristic features of Romanticism or Realism, let us begin by looking at one particular painting here. This is a painting painted by a very famous Spanish painter called Francisco Goya. He painted this work in 1814, and look at the title of this work called 3rd of May 1808. Now, this is very interesting. He is painting this work in 1814, and the title suggests some event, something that had happened just few years back, that is in 1808. Now, what was that event? And what this painting is all about? Obviously, this painting is painted as an immediate reaction to the horrific incident that took place in Madrid on 2nd and 3rd of 1808, of May in 1808, and when hundreds of Spanish freedom fighters were brutally killed, massacred by the French army. And Goya in this painting is not exactly depicting the incident the way a history painter would be doing it. He is basically evoking certain emotion. He is expressing his anguish, his anger, and he is obviously sympathizing with the freedom fighters. Painting of this kind is something very new in the history of Western art, and therefore this painting has been considered by many as the first modern painting in the world art history. Now let us look at another painting by another painter, a French painter this time, called Delacroix, a painting that he painted in 1830, having a title called Liberty Leading the People. Once again, the title immediately suggests or refers to the French Revolution, and this painting was made in response to the political upheaval that would resulted in the overthrow of the reigning monarch of Charles X. Like the previous work by Goya, this work by Delacroix too is based on contemporary reality with direct reference to an event which is very close to their time, in fact which happened during their time. Now, this kind of approach to painting or a work of art where the subject matter is not something that you have borrowed from the past or legend or mythology or religion, a subject matter which is also not very personal or individual, a social subject matter, a political subject matter, a political incident or event shared by many people. And here you find two painters painting works based on not only these events but also based on their response to these events. Now that makes these paintings very unique. So both these paintings indicate in that sense a very clear break from the tradition, and historically they have been connected to the movement called Romanticism. In fact, in a letter written by Delacroix, he writes that I have undertaken a modern subject, a barricade, so that if I did not win for my country, I will at least be painting for it. So you see, for the first time an artist is using the term modern to describe the nature of his subject matter or work. But then what is Romanticism? And what were the objectives of this art movement which took place in mid-19th century? Now, generally speaking, Romanticism kind of unfolded itself at the dawn of the 19th century, when the struggle to impose a new democratic political and social order was in the process. People grew anxious in response to ongoing political turmoil and uncertainty. So clearly, there was a political context, a social context. Now, if you look at the art produced under this ideology called Romanticism, mostly paintings, they seem to be characterized by these following points. Number one, imagination. Most of the Romantic painters emphasized imagination over reason. And in that sense, this overemphasis on the element of imagination seems to be a backlash against the rationalism characterized by the preceding period called New Classical period. Secondly, intuition. Art not only tried to evoke emotion, but the painters also followed their own intuitive feeling, intuitive drive very sincerely. And thirdly, inspiration. The Romantic artist was an inspired creator rather than a technical master. So following this logic, this is very clear that from Romanticism art movement onwards, most of the painters are clearly giving more emphasis and more importance to this inspiration, emotion, rather than the mere technical skill. Now, what this means is going with the moment or being spontaneous rather than getting it precise. So, if you go back to that painting by Goya, in spite of the fact that Goya was a very skilled painter, academically trained painter, in this painting, he is not so much bothered about the accuracy of the form or the clarity of the color or neatness of the composition, because in this painting and many other paintings done by him, he was more concerned with the evocative power of the painting. He was more interested to achieve the expression through his painting rather than accuracy of anatomy, proportion, perspective, and all these things. And of course, Romanticism gives birth to, once again, after Renaissance period, individuality. So Romanticism is an idea that was certainly shared by many artists and painters of that time, but at the same time, it celebrated the individual. In fact, governments and movements should not sacrifice the individual, but it should raise him or her. That was the idea shared by many of these people, the artists, painters, poets. Now, one of the very, very important painters from this Romantic movement was Turner. And certainly Turner emerged as not only England's most dramatic Romantic painter, but of the entire Europe. For him, the depiction of light and atmosphere was the most important part of the painting. He portrayed nature at its most violent situation. This is interesting, because in the preceding era, in the previous period, we have seen that painters mostly looked at nature as something through which they could show the serene quality of nature, the peaceful quality of nature, the tranquility of nature. But when you look at Turner's paintings, it is something absolutely different. There is hardly any serenity, forget about peaceful quality in his paintings. And in order to achieve that, he is kind of giving up any approach to any attitude to going for precise detail, but he is rather using very loose and violent brushworks, applying bright colors, and also he is not bothered about sharp contour lines and all that. Hence, when you look at his paintings, for example this one, what you say is a painting or an image which is, to use a more contemporary term, out of focus. This is because he is not bothered about precise contour lines. He is more interested in the overall visual effect of the scene that he is depicting. Now look at this one. This particular painting called The Fighting Temeraire is also about a situation where you see fire, you see a violent and a restless sky, and you see shapes, you see elements which are not static at all. In fact, this particular painting, very famous painting, painted in 1844 and called Rain, Steam and Speed, is a classic example of Turner's art, what Turner stood for. In fact, a classical painter of the preceding period in the Western art history would have outrightly rejected this kind of painting. But in this case, for us, it is an absolutely fantastic work, because this so-called visual ambiguity, this visual confusion, if I may use this term, is what we enjoy, what we admire. Instead of going for precision, Turner is going for visual effect. And in order to achieve that, Turner is using absolutely unique kind of brushwork, technical application, which was hitherto unseen. Nobody had done that before. Hence, Turner happens to be an eye-opener in the history of modern art. He is a kind of pioneer in liberating the painterly skills from the conventional rules and regulations. In fact, he is also painting subject matters which are also not very peaceful, not very calm. He is deliberately and selectively going for subject matters which are violent. So this also goes to show how his mind must have been working in terms of not only painting or painting technique, but also in terms of subject matters that he is choosing. Now look at this comparison between one neoclassical painting by David and a romantic painting by Turner. Clearly, the neoclassical painting reveals all kinds of concerns with precision, accuracy, and a clarity of forms, distance, perspective, chiaroscuro, light and shade, whereas look at Turner's paintings. He simply rejects all these classical and academic norms and innovates a new method of painting, a new approach to painting altogether. Now, Caspar David Friedrich should be considered as another very important painter from the Romantic movement, though he was not from England, he was from Germany, and he contributed a lot to the development of the Romantic art movement. In Caspar David Friedrich's painting, you may not find the kind of violent brushstrokes and surface treatment you see in Turner's paintings. Maybe comparatively, Caspar David Friedrich's paintings have a lot of clarity. Yet, if you look at his paintings very carefully, you will feel a sense of loss, a sense of mystery, and also repeatedly throughout his career, Caspar David in his paintings tried to express the formidable presence of nature and how a human being feels absolutely insignificant, powerless and helpless in front of that formidable nature. So, nature not necessarily in terms of its violent character, but nature as it is may also appear to be something that is immensely powerful and therefore formidable for human being to negotiate. So, this is what Caspar David Friedrich as a romantic painter continuously has been exploring in his paintings. So, the common romantic elements would be no hint of idealization in depicting the different attributes of nature, individualistic approach, personal interpretation in execution and thought process, of course spontaneous expressions, then rebellion against the existing conventions. They made it very clear, most of the romantic painters, that they were not going to follow the conventional rules, rather they would create their own rules. In that sense, these romantic painters were very, very innovative. And an excitement that they felt from the different scenes of the countryside and the various phenomena of the nature had constantly been the inspiring element, and that formed the chief subject for painting in the landscapes of these painters. So, it was not necessary for the romantic painters to look for a subject that has to be something grand, something that already have some mythological, historical bearing. They could choose any subject matter for that matter, any piece of nature, any corner of nature, and can work on that to create a sensation that they might have felt. So, to focus on subjects and scenes which are apparently very commonplace, but once they get painted by very innovative painters, even a very commonplace subject matter can achieve or assume a dignity that was hitherto unknown. This is what romantic or the artworks done during the romantic movement show, and this is what we shall find happening in the following art movement, that is realism. It's the same thing will be happening over there too. Another very well known painter from the romantic movement who hailed from England was John Constable. Now, John Constable's paintings are relatively calm compared to Turner or even Caspar David Friedrich. There is a quality of serenity, but his contribution to the genre of landscape painting was to, or rather not to wait for some grand event to happen in nature. Anything from nature in his landscape around the village he lived could be a subject matter. Now, Romanticism was followed by the next significant art movement called Realism. Realism attempts to create a truthful and accurate depiction of the models that nature and contemporary life offer to the artists. So, there is this element of reality there, but unlike the previous classical reality, which was based on a preconceived model, in this art movement of mid-19th century called realism, artists are looking at how a particular figure or object appears right now. So, the artificiality of both the classicism and romanticism in the academic art was unanimously rejected by the realist painters. New idea was that ordinary people and everyday activities are worthy subjects for art. This is also very interesting. Anything, anybody, any common person, any ordinary person could be a subject matter for your art. Artists, the realists, attempted to portray the lives appearances, the problems, the customs, the social situation and modes of the middle and lower classes, of the unexceptional, unassuming, the ordinary, the humble, the unadorned. And this is what you will see happening in the paintings done by very famous painters from the realist movement or realism movement called Gustave Courbet or Millet and others. For example, look at this painting by Courbet called The Stone Breakers. Who are these two people? They are hard-working people, and they don't have any social dignity in the traditional and classical hierarchy of the society, yet for Courbet they are the ideal subject matters for a painting. In essence, by doing some paintings based on the life of the people coming from the hard-working the society where they are in a sense exploited to a great extent, Courbet is definitely glorifying not the way they live but their self-dignity. Millet, look at this painting by Millet called The Gleaners. 3 women gleaning crops after the harvest. This is such a commonplace and ordinary subject matter that throughout the history of art until Millet painted this kind of subject matters have always been overlooked. But Millet doesn't. He doesn't overlook. So he picks it up and makes a fantastic painting out of this subject matter. Again, in this case, this particular painting by Millet, or if you look at the previous painting by Courbet, in both these paintings, the individual figures remain rather anonymous, because perhaps here individual persons are not what Millet or Courbet were concerned about. They were perhaps more concerned with the social identity, the class identity of these people. Another painter from the same time and belonging to the same movement called Temeraire was also doing paintings like this, the third class carriage. The third class carriage where people, the travelers, they come from the lowest class of the society, and they are the most hardworking and economically deprived class, and they become the subject matters for these artists like Temeraire. In fact, Temeraire goes to the extent of doing a piece of drawing in lithograph about a person who is not only poor or deprived but completely derelict. Could be a drunk, could be somebody who doesn't have any place, any dignity, any respect in the society, and these kind of people become the subject matters for them. In fact, look at this wonderful sketch by Courbet where he draws a young lad in a sleeping posture. I mean, apart from the fact that this is a very accurate and perfect drawing, what one feels and can respond by looking at this work is the empathy, the feeling, how Courbet is able to not only see the structure and form of the boy, but how Courbet is also able to feel the existence of the boy, feel that moment of that boy when he is sleeping with his hands kept on an open book. A very interesting drawing. And then again, Courbet does this wonderful oil on canvas, and the subject is again very strange if you look at it from the point of view of the classical art or the traditional Western art. It is the title is The Wounded Man, and the subject of the painting is exactly that, a man who is lying and he is wounded. You can also see a blood spot on his chest. Not that he was somebody very famous or a very well-known soldier or somebody like that. Could be a very ordinary person. But right now he is wounded and Courbet feels empathy towards him and he makes a painting. So, in other words, when you look at the various examples of paintings done by Millet or Courbet or Daumier or anybody else from realism movement, you see that what you see here once again, that individual facial features is something that is absent here. You don't get to actually very clearly see how these people look like, but you can very clearly see and feel and get some information about the social class these people belong to. So this is very interesting that repeatedly, in spite of their ability, the painter's ability to depict all the details accurately, the painters are making certain selections that, as far as Courbet and Millet are concerned, in most of their paintings, they are not showing the faces of these people very clearly, but they are showing the identity of these people without any ambiguity. So the figures, in terms of the drawing, the color and the tonality, they appear very simple and plain. The figures are firmly modeled with some dignity, and they are simply emphasized in terms of a strong and solid build, and the figures assume a dignity more natural and more convincing, because if you look at their gesture, posture, the way they are walking, talking or sitting or working, like the one that you had seen in the first image where Courbet does a painting on those stone breakers, they are so engaged with their work, they are engaged with their life, that these characters in the painting are hardly aware of the presence of the painter. These are not posed figures or figures with very specific postures. They are there in their own life, and here is the painter who is painting them. Thank you.